never expected that a simple walk in the park would change everything I thought I knew about my life. It was one of those gray October afternoons when the world feels suspended between seasons, and I found myself wandering through Riverside Park with nowhere else to go. The divorce papers had been signed that morning, and my apartment felt too small, too quiet, too full of memories I wasn't ready to face. The park was nearly empty, except for a few joggers and an elderly man feeding pigeons near the fountain. I chose a bench overlooking the small pond, where ducks glided silently across the dark water. The silence was exactly what I needed, or so I thought. I pulled my jacket tighter against the autumn chill and closed my eyes, trying to make sense of how my life had unraveled so completely in just 6 months. That's when I heard it, a voice calling my name from somewhere behind me, soft but unmistakably familiar. Sarah? Sarah Mitchell? I turned around, my heart skipping a beat. Standing about 20 feet away was a woman in her 60s, wearing a burgundy coat and a gentle smile that made my chest tighten with recognition. It was Mrs. Henderson, my third-grade teacher from Oakwood Elementary. I hadn't seen her in over 25 years, not since I was 8 years old. Mrs. Henderson? I stood up, feeling suddenly like that shy little girl again. I can't believe it's you. She walked over with the same measured pace I remembered from those long-ago classroom days, her eyes twinkling with the same warmth that had made her my favorite teacher. My goodness, Sarah. Look at you, all grown up, though you still have those same thoughtful eyes. We embraced awkwardly, the way adults do when they're trying to bridge decades of absence. She smelled like lavender and old books, exactly as I remembered. For a moment, I was transported back to room 14, where Mrs. Henderson had been the first adult outside my family to really see me. "What brings you to the park today?" she asked, settling beside me on the bench. I hesitated, not wanting to burden her with my troubles. Just needed some fresh air. "What about you?" She smiled knowingly. "I come here every few weeks to think. It's where I've been coming since my husband died 3 years ago. Sometimes the best conversations are the ones we have with ourselves. Don't you think?" Something in her tone told me she understood more than she was letting on. Mrs. Henderson had always been perceptive that way. She could read a classroom full of 8-year-olds like an open book, sensing who needed encouragement, who was struggling at home, who just needed someone to listen. "I remember you were always such a thoughtful child," she continued. "You'd sit in the back corner and write these beautiful stories. Do you still write?" I shook my head, feeling a familiar pang of regret. "Not for years. Life got in the way, I suppose." "Life has a way of doing that," she said gently. "But it also has a way of bringing us back to what matters when we need it most." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the ducks paddle across the pond. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the water. I found myself wanting to tell her everything, about the divorce, about feeling lost, about how I'd somehow become a stranger to myself over the years. "Mrs. Henderson," I began hesitantly. "Do you remember that story I wrote about the girl who could talk to trees?" Her face lit up. "Of course I do. You were so proud of that story. You spent weeks on it, writing it in that careful handwriting of yours. You told me it was special, that I had a gift." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "I believed you back then, and you should still believe it now," she said firmly. "Sarah, that story wasn't just imaginative, it was profound. You wrote about a girl who felt disconnected from the world until she learned to listen to the wisdom of nature. Even at 8 years old, you understood something many adults never grasp." I stared at her, surprised by the intensity in her voice. I'd forgotten about that story until just now. I never forgot it. In fact, she paused, reaching into her purse. "I kept it all these years." My breath caught in my throat as she pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, My childhood handwriting was still visible across the top. The Girl Who Listened to Trees by Sarah Mitchell, age 8. "You kept my story?" I whispered, taking the paper with trembling hands. I kept stories from many of my students over the years, but this one was special. It reminded me why I became a teacher in the first place. She watched as I unfolded the paper carefully. "You wrote about finding your voice by listening to others who couldn't speak for themselves. The trees in your story were being cut down to build a shopping mall, and only the little girl could hear their cries for help." As I read my 8-year-old words, the memory came flooding back. I had been so passionate about that story, staying up late with a flashlight under my covers to finish it. I'd illustrated it with colored pencils, drawing elaborate pictures of the girl sitting beneath enormous oak trees, their branches reaching toward her like arms. In the end, Mrs. Henderson continued, "The girl convinced the whole town to listen to the trees, and they found a way to build around them instead of destroying them. Do you remember what you wrote in the final paragraph?" I scanned to the bottom of the page and read aloud in a shaky voice. "Sometimes the most important voices are the ones that can't speak for themselves. And sometimes we have to lose everything to find out who we really are." The words hit me like a physical blow. Here I was, 25 years later, sitting in a park feeling like I'd lost everything, and my 8-year-old self had somehow known exactly what I needed to hear. "How did you know I'd need this today?" I asked, looking up at Mrs. Henderson through tears. She smiled mysteriously. "I didn't, but I've carried it with me for 3 years, ever since my husband passed. He used to tell me that we meet the right people at exactly the right time, even if it doesn't make sense at first. Your husband sounds like he was a wise man." "Oh, he was. He was also the school janitor at Oakwood Elementary." She laughed at my surprised expression. "How do you think I knew to find you at the park today? Harold always said you were the one student he'd never forget. You were the only child who ever thanked him for cleaning your classroom." My mind reeled. Mr. Harold, the quiet janitor who'd always given me a gentle smile when I stayed after school to work on projects. I'd forgotten about him entirely until this moment. He remembered me. He remembered all the children. But you were special to him. You see, Harold was an immigrant who never learned to read properly. He was embarrassed about it his whole life. But you... She paused, emotion thick in her voice. "You used to read your stories to him while he cleaned. You never asked why or made him feel foolish. You just shared your words with someone who treasured them." I was crying openly now, overwhelmed by the weight of these forgotten connections. I had no idea. Harold made me promise something before he died. He said if I ever ran into you, I should tell you that your stories gave him courage to finally learn to read. He was 73 years old when he enrolled in adult literacy classes, and it was all because a little girl showed him that words have power. The park around us had grown quiet as evening approached. The last joggers had headed home, and even the ducks had settled in for the night. But I felt more awake than I had in months. "Mrs. Henderson, I need to tell you something." I took a deep breath. "I got divorced today. I've been sitting here feeling sorry for myself, thinking my life is over at 33. But listening to you, reading this story, I'm realizing I've been so focused on who I thought I should be that I forgot who I actually am." She nodded knowingly. "And who are you, Sarah?" I looked down at the story in my hands, at the passionate words of my younger self, who believed in magic and the power of listening. I'm someone who has stories to tell. I'm someone who believes voices matter, even the quiet ones. "Especially the quiet ones," she corrected gently. We talked until the streetlights came on, sharing stories about the years between then and now. Mrs. Henderson told me about her 40-year teaching career, about the students who'd touched her life, about learning to live alone after Harold's death. I told her about my marriage that had slowly suffocated my creativity, about the job in marketing that paid well, but left me empty, about dreams I'd buried so deep I'd almost convinced myself they'd never existed. As we prepared to part ways, she pressed something else into my hand. It was a small notebook, leather-bound and well-worn. "This was Harold's," she said. "He bought it when he started learning to read, planning to write down new words he learned. But in the end, he said he wanted it to go to someone who would fill it with stories that matter." I clutched the notebook to my chest, feeling its weight and potential. "Thank you, both of you. I don't know how to repay this." "Write," she said simply. "Write the stories that are waiting inside you. Write for the voices that can't speak for themselves. Write because the world needs to hear what you have to say." As I walked home that night, my mind was racing with possibilities. For the first time in years, I felt truly alive. I thought about environmental destruction, about marginalized communities, about all the modern trees that needed someone to listen to their silent cries for help. That night, I opened Harold's notebook and began to write. The words flowed like water after a drought, story after story pouring out of me. I wrote about a janitor who learned to read at 73. I wrote about a teacher who carried her students' dreams in her purse for decades. I wrote about a woman who rediscovered herself in a park on the worst day of her life. But here's the part that still gives me chills when I think about it. 3 weeks later, I was researching online for a story I was writing about elderly immigrants and literacy programs. I wanted to honor Harold's memory by highlighting similar struggles. That's when I found his obituary from 3 years ago. Harold Henderson had died on October 15th, exactly 3 years to the day before I met Mrs. Henderson in the park. And Mrs. Henderson? I searched for her too, wanting to send her copies of the stories I'd been writing. "Sarah, this is where my world turned upside down completely. Mrs. Margaret Henderson had died 2 years ago. Her obituary mentioned that she was survived by no one, having never married, and that she'd left her entire estate to literacy programs, in honor of someone named Harold who had inspired her to keep teaching even in her final years." I sat staring at my computer screen for hours, trying to make sense of what had happened. The story in my hand was real. I'd had it analyzed, and the paper dated back to the right time period. The handwriting was definitely mine. The notebook was real too, with Harold's name embossed on the inside cover. But the woman I'd spent that evening with, who had given me back my purpose and my voice, according to every official record, she couldn't have been there. I've spent months trying to rationalize it, to find some logical explanation. Maybe I'd misremembered the names. Maybe I'd confused my teacher with someone else. Maybe grief and divorce had caused some kind of breakdown. But deep in my heart, I know what happened was real. Mrs. Henderson and Harold had somehow found a way to give me exactly what I needed when I needed it most. The stories I've written since that night have been published in magazines and literary journals. I've started a blog about finding your voice in midlife, and it's reached thousands of people going through their own transitions. I volunteer at the literacy center that received Mrs. Henderson's estate, reading to adults who are learning to read for the first time. Every October 15th, I go back to that bench in Riverside Park. I bring new stories to read aloud, hoping that somewhere, Harold can hear them. I carry Harold's notebook everywhere now, and it's nearly full of stories about people whose voices deserve to be heard. Sometimes the most extraordinary things happen in the most ordinary moments. Sometimes we need to lose everything to remember who we really are. And sometimes the people who change our lives are the ones who were never really there at all. Or maybe they were more there than anyone else could ever be. I still can't explain what happened that day in the park, but I've stopped trying to. Instead, I choose to believe in the magic of stories, in the power of connection across time and space, and in the possibility that love and inspiration can transcend even death itself. If my story has touched you in any way, I'd love to hear about your own moments of unexpected grace in the comments below. Have you ever had an encounter that seemed impossible but changed everything? Have you rediscovered a forgotten part of yourself when you needed it most? Your stories matter too, and sharing them helps all of us feel less alone in this mysterious, beautiful world. And if this story resonated with you, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing. You never know when the next story might be exactly what someone needs to hear.